The notification sound on my laptop made my blood run cold. Not because it was unexpected. I'd been getting emails all morning about the Henderson-Blackstone merger that would reshape the entire telecommunications industry. But this email wasn't about quarterly projections or regulatory compliance. The subject line read, "Immediate termination of employment, effective immediately." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stared at the screen in my corner office on the 47th floor of Meridian Capital, watching the Seattle skyline blur through rain-streaked windows. 18 months of 16-hour days. 18 months of sacrificing everything, my marriage, my health, my sanity, to orchestrate the most complex international acquisition in our firm's history. And they were firing me. By email. While I still had the final signature page for the $2.1 billion deal sitting on my desk. The irony wasn't lost on me. In exactly 43 minutes, I was supposed to walk into the executive boardroom and hand over the completed merger documents that would make Marcus Wellborn, my backstabbing colleague, the youngest senior vice president in company history. The same Marcus who'd been systematically sabotaging my work for months, feeding lies to our managing director about my performance issues and difficulty working with international clients. I picked up the final signature page, my name typed neatly under the authorization line, Victoria Chen, Lead Mergers and Acquisitions Attorney. But that's not the name I wrote when I signed it 20 minutes later. 3 years earlier, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a downtown Seattle law firm plotting corporate revenge. I was fresh out of Columbia Law School, armed with a Harvard MBA and naive enough to believe that merit actually mattered in the cutthroat world of high-stakes corporate law. Meridian Capital had recruited me aggressively, promising partnership, track, and the kind of challenging international work that most attorneys only dream about. Jennifer Sullivan, the firm's managing director, had personally flown to New York to convince me to join their mergers and acquisitions team. "Victoria," she'd said over dinner at some impossibly expensive restaurant in Midtown, "we need someone with your combination of legal expertise and business acumen. Someone who understands both the American and international markets. Someone who can handle the pressure of billion-dollar deals." The offer was too good to refuse. $180,000 starting salary, full relocation package, and the promise of rapid advancement for top performers. I accepted on the spot, ignoring the tiny voice in my head that wondered why they were trying so hard to recruit someone straight out of school for such high-level work. My first day at Meridian Capital should have been a warning. The Seattle office occupied 3 full floors of the Columbia Center, all glass and steel and understated luxury that screamed, "We bill $800 an hour, and we're worth every penny." The M&A department was on the 47th floor, and I was assigned a small office with a decent view and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. That's where I first met Marcus Wellborn. He was everything I wasn't: 4th-generation Seattle money, Yale Law School, father who'd been a federal judge, mother who sat on the boards of half a dozen nonprofits. At 28, he was 2 years older than me and had been with the firm for 3 years, which in the hyper-competitive world of big law made him practically a veteran. "You must be the Columbia Wonder Kid," he said, leaning against my office doorframe with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. "Jennifer's been talking about you non-stop. Apparently, you're going to revolutionize international M&A." I should have caught the subtle condescension in his tone, but I was too busy trying to make a good impression. "Just hoping to contribute," I said, standing up to shake his hand. "I know I have a lot to learn." "That you do," Marcus replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lucky for you, I'll be showing you the ropes. We're going to be working very closely together." For the first few months, Marcus was everything a mentor should be. He walked me through the firm's client relationships, introduced me to the key players in Seattle's business community, and patiently explained the intricate, dance of international regulatory compliance that made cross-border deals so complex. I was grateful for his guidance and genuinely believed we were building a strong professional partnership. The work itself was intoxicating. Meridian Capital specialized in massive transactions, the kind of deals that made headlines in the wall, Street Journal, and reshaped entire industries overnight. My first major project was a $400 million acquisition of a Canadian telecommunications company by one of our longtime clients, Pinnacle Industries. Marcus was the lead attorney, and I was essentially his research assistant, but I threw myself into the work with the intensity of someone who'd waited their entire career for this opportunity. I spent weeks in Vancouver, working 18-hour days to navigate the labyrinth of Canadian foreign investment regulations. While Marcus handled the high-level negotiations and client relations, I was deep in the weeds of regulatory filings, due diligence reports, and compliance documentation. It was tedious, exhausting work, but I loved every minute of it. The breakthrough came when I discovered a potential issue with the target company's spectrum licenses that could have derailed the entire deal. Hidden in hundreds of pages of regulatory filings was a clause that would have triggered a costly review process if the acquisition went through as originally structured. I spent 3 sleepless nights figuring out a creative restructuring that would avoid the problem entirely. When I presented my findings to Marcus, his reaction was immediate and effusive. "Victoria, this is brilliant," he said, studying my analysis. "This could have cost our client millions in delays and legal fees. You may have just saved the entire deal." I felt a rush of professional pride unlike anything I'd experienced in law school. This was why I'd chosen corporate law, the intellectual challenge of solving complex problems under enormous pressure. The satisfaction of seeing months of work culminate in transactions that would affect thousands of jobs and billions. In economic activity, the Canadian deal closed successfully, and I received glowing reviews for my contribution. Jennifer Sullivan personally commended my work in the weekly department meeting, noting that my creative legal thinking and attention to detail had been instrumental in the acquisition's success. I was riding high, convinced that I'd found my calling and my place at Meridian Capital. But success in big law is a double-edged sword. The better you perform, the more work gets piled on your desk, and the higher the expectations become. Within weeks of closing the Canadian deal, I was assigned to 3 new transactions simultaneously: a private equity buyout in Mexico, a joint venture between American and German technology companies, and a complex restructuring of a multinational shipping conglomerate. The hours became crushing. I was regularly pulling all-nighters, surviving on coffee and takeout food, barely seeing daylight except through my office windows. My personal life, which had never been particularly robust, essentially ceased to exist. I canceled dinner plans, skipped friends' weddings, and stopped returning calls from my family back in California. But I told myself it was worth it. I was learning at an incredible pace, handling sophisticated legal work that most attorneys wouldn't see until they were decades into their careers. More importantly, I was making myself indispensable to the firm's most important clients and most lucrative deals. The pattern continued for 2 years. I worked on increasingly complex transactions, consistently delivered excellent results, and watched my reputation within the firm grow. I received 2 promotions in 18 months, first to senior associate, then to principal associate, putting me on the fast track to partnership consideration. Throughout this period, Marcus and I maintained what I thought was a strong working relationship. We were assigned to most major deals together, with him typically serving as lead counsel and me handling the complex technical and regulatory work. It seemed like a perfect partnership. His client relationships and strategic thinking combined with my technical expertise and willingness to handle the grinding detail work that made deals successful. I should have realized something was wrong when Marcus started getting all the credit for our joint successes. When the Mexico private equity deal was featured in American Lawyer as one of the year's most innovative cross-border transactions, the article quoted only Marcus, describing him as the brilliant young attorney who restructured the deal to avoid regulatory complications. My name appeared once in the final paragraph, as part of the dedicated team that supported the complex transaction. At first, I didn't mind. I was focused on the work itself, not the public recognition. I assumed that my contributions were being noted by the people who mattered, the partners who would make decisions about my career advancement. I was naive enough to believe that excellence would speak for itself. The warning signs became harder to ignore during my third year at the firm. I noticed that Marcus had started scheduling client meetings without inviting me, even on deals where I was doing the majority of the substantive work. When I asked about it, he always had reasonable explanations. The meetings were just preliminary discussions, or the clients preferred to keep the initial conversations small, or he didn't want to overwhelm them with too many attorneys. More troubling was the way my direct communication with clients was gradually being curtailed. Marcus began insisting that all client contact go through him, explaining that it was important to maintain consistent messaging and avoid confusing clients, with multiple points of contact. I accepted this at first. Client relations had never been my strongest suit, and I was happy to focus on the legal and technical work. But I started noticing discrepancies between what clients were asking for and what Marcus was telling me they wanted. On a particularly complex acquisition involving a Japanese semiconductor company, I spent weeks preparing regulatory analyses for issues that seemed oddly tangential to the deal structure. When I finally had a chance to speak directly with the client's in-house counsel, I discovered that they had never requested most of the work I'd been doing. We asked Marcus about potential antitrust issues in the European market, the client explained during a conference call. But most of the analysis you've prepared seems to focus on completely different regulatory frameworks. Are we missing something? I felt a chill of realization. Marcus had been deliberately misdirecting my work, having me prepare irrelevant analyses, while handling the actual client requests himself. When I confronted him about it later, he was smoothly apologetic. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm sorry for the confusion, Victoria, he said with his trademark charming smile. I should have been clearer about the client's priorities. You know how these deals evolve. What seems important one week can become irrelevant the next. It was a plausible explanation, but something felt wrong. I started paying closer attention to the dynamics of our working relationship, and what I discovered made my stomach turn. Marcus had been systematically taking credit for my work, while simultaneously undermining my credibility with clients and colleagues. The most damaging pattern was subtle but consistent. In client meetings and internal discussions, Marcus would present strategic recommendations that were based entirely on my research and analysis, but he'd frame them as his own insights. Meanwhile, he'd highlight any minor errors or oversights in my work, always in a way that seemed helpful and collegial, but actually served to undermine confidence in my abilities. Victoria's analysis is solid, as always, he'd say to a room full of partners and clients, but I think we need to be careful about her tendency to get lost in the technical details. Sometimes she misses the bigger strategic picture. The criticism was always delivered with a smile and a tone of mentorly concern, making it difficult to object without seeming defensive or ungrateful. But the cumulative effect was devastating. Gradually, I found myself being excluded from important meetings, bypassed for high-profile assignments, and treated as Marcus's highly skilled but ultimately junior subordinate rather than an equal partner in our deals. The situation reached a breaking point during a partner evaluation meeting in my third year. I had been expecting positive feedback based on the excellent results I'd delivered on a series of major transactions. Instead, I received a performance review that was lukewarm at best. Victoria is certainly technically competent, Jennifer, Sullivan told me during our one-on-one meeting, But there are concerns about your ability to handle client relationships and strategic thinking. Several partners have noted that you sometimes seem to struggle with seeing the forest for the trees. I sat there in shock, listening to criticisms that seemed to have no basis in reality. I had consistently delivered exceptional work product, solved complex problems that had saved clients millions of dollars, and worked longer hours than almost anyone else in the department. But somehow, I was being characterized as a detail-oriented worker bee who lacked the strategic vision necessary for partnership. "I'm surprised to hear this feedback," I said carefully. "Could you give me specific examples of where I've fallen, short in terms of strategic thinking or client relations?" Jennifer's response was vague and unsatisfying. She mentioned concerns raised by colleagues and client feedback, but couldn't provide concrete examples. It became clear that my reputation was being shaped by secondhand reports rather than direct evaluation of my work. That night, I went home to my empty apartment and did something I hadn't done since law school. I cried. Not just from frustration or disappointment, but from the crushing realization that I had been naive about how the game was really played. I had assumed that working hard and delivering excellent results would be enough. I had trusted Marcus to be a fair partner and advocate. I had believed that merit would ultimately triumph over politics. I was wrong on all counts, but I wasn't ready to give up. If Marcus wanted to play political games, I would learn to play them better than he did. If he was going to take credit for my work, I would make sure to document my contributions more carefully. If he was going to undermine me with clients and colleagues, I would find ways to build my own relationships and reputation. What I didn't realize was that Marcus was already 3 steps ahead of me, orchestrating a long-term strategy that would culminate in the Henderson-Blackstone merger and my professional destruction. The Henderson-Blackstone merger opportunity came disguised as salvation. It was February when Jennifer Sullivan called me into her office with what she described as the career-making assignment you've been waiting for. "We've been selected as lead counsel for what could be the largest telecommunications merger in industry history," she said, sliding a thick confidential briefing packet across her mahogany desk. "Henderson Communications wants to acquire Blackstone, International's entire European and Asian operations. We're talking about a $2.1 billion transaction that will reshape global telecommunications infrastructure." I opened the briefing packet, my pulse quickening as I scanned the executive summary. Henderson Communications was a mid-tier American telecom company with ambitious growth plans but limited international presence. Blackstone International was a European giant with extensive operations across 15 countries, but they were hemorrhaging cash due to regulatory challenges and technological obsolescence. On paper, it looked like a perfect match. Henderson needed global reach. Blackstone needed capital and American market access. "The complexity here is extraordinary," Jennifer continued. "We're dealing with telecommunications regulations in 8 different countries, antitrust approvals from both the EU and FTC, currency hedging for multiple billion-dollar tranches, and technology transfer agreements that touch on national security concerns. This isn't just a merger. It's a geopolitical chess match." My mind was already racing through the regulatory frameworks we'd need to navigate. European data privacy laws, Asian foreign investment restrictions, American national security reviews for telecommunications infrastructure. It was exactly the kind of intellectually challenging, career-defining work I'd dreamed about when I first arrived at Meridian Capital. "I want you leading the regulatory compliance team," Jennifer said. "Marcus will handle overall deal strategy and client relations. But the success of this transaction depends entirely on navigating the international regulatory maze. That's your specialty." For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about work. This was my chance to prove that I was more than just Marcus's detail-oriented subordinate. The Henderson-Blackstone merger would require the kind of sophisticated regulatory analysis that played directly to my strengths, and the high profile of the deal meant that success would be impossible to hide or minimize. I threw myself into the preliminary research with renewed energy. I spent the next 2 weeks mapping out regulatory approval processes across 8 jurisdictions, identifying potential approval bottlenecks, and developing preliminary strategies for addressing likely objections from competition authorities. The work was incredibly complex, but I could see pathways through the regulatory labyrinth that would make the merger feasible. My initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. The deal structure would need careful crafting to avoid triggering lengthy review processes, and we'd need to coordinate simultaneous regulatory filings across multiple jurisdictions. But there were no insurmountable obstacles. With proper planning and execution, we could probably get all necessary approvals within 12 to 18 months. Marcus seemed genuinely impressed when I presented my preliminary findings. "This is exceptional work, Victoria," he said, reviewing my regulatory roadmap. "I had no idea the approval process would be this complex. Your analysis is going to be crucial for structuring the deal properly." For a moment, I felt like we were back to being genuine partners. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my regulatory strategy, offered helpful suggestions for managing client expectations, and seemed genuinely collaborative rather than competitive. I wondered if I had been paranoid about his previous behavior, if the stress of big law had made me overly suspicious of normal workplace dynamics. The Henderson Communications leadership team flew in from Dallas for our first major strategy meeting in early March. CEO Robert Henderson was a barrel-chested Texan in his early 60s who'd built his company from a small regional provider into a national player through aggressive acquisitions. His CFO, Patricia Morrison, was a sharp-eyed former investment banker who clearly understood the financial intricacies of complex transactions. "We've been watching Blackstone's struggles for 2 years," Henderson explained during our initial meeting. "Their European infrastructure is world-class, but they're drowning in regulatory compliance costs and technology upgrade requirements. We can provide the capital they need, and they can give us the international footprint we need to compete with the major players." Morrison pulled out detailed financial projections showing how the combined entity would achieve significant cost synergies while dramatically expanding market reach. "The economics are compelling," she said, "but we know the regulatory approval process will be the make-or-break factor. That's why we chose Meridian Capital. We need lawyers who can navigate international compliance requirements without derailing the deal timeline." I felt a surge of professional pride as I walked them through my regulatory analysis. This was what I'd trained for, explaining complex legal frameworks to sophisticated business clients, helping them understand both opportunities and risks, and developing strategies that would turn legal obstacles into competitive advantages. "The key insight from Victoria's analysis," Marcus interjected smoothly, "is that we need to structure this as a series of coordinated transactions rather than a single acquisition. That will allow us to stage the regulatory approvals and avoid triggering the most onerous review processes." I blinked in surprise. The staged transaction structure had been my recommendation, developed after weeks of detailed regulatory research. Marcus was presenting it as if it had been his strategic insight, while positioning my work as merely supportive analysis. "Exactly right," Henderson nodded approvingly. "We were hoping you'd see that angle. Our previous legal team suggested a straightforward acquisition structure that would have taken years to get approved. Victoria's research was essential for identifying the regulatory bottlenecks," Marcus continued with his practiced smile. "But the strategic restructuring is what will make this deal actually executable." I sat there feeling like I was watching a magic trick in reverse, seeing exactly how the illusion was performed but powerless to expose it without seeming petty or unprofessional. Marcus had just taken credit for my core strategic recommendation, while simultaneously diminishing my contribution to research support. The pattern continued through the spring as we developed the full merger structure. I would spend weeks analyzing complex regulatory requirements, developing innovative compliance strategies, and crafting legal solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Marcus would then present my work to clients and colleagues as implementation of his strategic vision, always giving me credit for excellent technical support, while positioning himself as the deal's mastermind. The most frustrating part was how skillfully he managed the optics. Marcus never claimed direct credit for specific analyses or research. He was too smart for such obvious theft. Instead, he framed every presentation as building on Victoria's research or implementing the strategy we developed together. Language. That sounded collaborative, but consistently positioned him as the senior strategist and me as the junior technician. By May, I had developed a comprehensive regulatory approval strategy that would allow Henderson Communications to acquire Blackstone International's operations through a carefully sequenced series of transactions across multiple jurisdictions. The structure was elegant in its complexity. We would start with the Asian operations, where regulatory barriers were lowest, then use those approvals as precedents for European filings, and finally complete the American elements once international approvals were secured. The strategy required precise timing and coordination across 8 different legal systems, but it would compress what should have been a 3-year approval process into 18 months, while significantly reducing the risk of regulatory rejection. It was the kind of sophisticated legal architecture that major law firms built their reputations on, and I knew it was the best work of my career. When we presented the final merger structure to both companies' boards of directors in a joint meeting at Henderson's Dallas headquarters, the response was unanimously enthusiastic. "This is exactly the kind of creative legal thinking we were hoping for," Blackstone's CEO, Wilhelm Brenner, said through a video connection from Frankfurt. "Your team has solved problems that our previous advisors said were unsolvable." Henderson nodded agreement. "Marcus, you and your team have exceeded our highest expectations. This transaction structure gives us everything we wanted: fast execution, regulatory certainty, and maximum strategic flexibility." I noticed that Henderson addressed his praise exclusively to Marcus, who accepted it graciously while making sure to acknowledge the exceptional technical work by Victoria and the rest of our team. Once again, I was relegated to anonymous team member status despite having architected the entire regulatory strategy. But I told myself it didn't matter. The Henderson-Blackstone merger would be the crowning achievement of my career, regardless of who got the credit. The legal community would recognize the sophistication of the regulatory work. Major publications would analyze the innovative transaction structure, and my career would be permanently established at the highest levels of international M&A practice. What I didn't realize was that Marcus had been planning something far more devastating than credit theft. The first sign of trouble came in late June, when I noticed that Marcus had started scheduling client calls and internal meetings at times when I was traveling for the deal. Since the merger required extensive coordination with regulatory authorities across multiple time zones, I was frequently out of the office, sometimes in Brussels meeting with EU competition officials, sometimes in Tokyo working with Japanese investment regulators, sometimes in London coordinating with Blackstone's legal team. Initially, I assumed the scheduling conflicts were coincidental. International deals created chaotic schedules, and it was often impossible to coordinate everyone's availability across multiple time zones. But I began to notice a pattern. Every time I returned from international travel, I would discover that important decisions had been made in my absence, often decisions that affected core elements of the regulatory strategy I had developed. "We had to pivot on the Asian filing sequence," Marcus would explain when I questioned why the strategy had changed while I was in Brussels. "The client wanted to accelerate the timeline, and we couldn't wait for you to get back from your EU meetings." The explanations were always reasonable, but the cumulative effect was that I was gradually being excluded from key strategic decisions about my own regulatory framework. Marcus was systematically taking control of the deal architecture I had created, making modifications that served his agenda rather than the client's best interests. The most troubling change involved the signature authority for final deal documents. Originally, we had structured the approval process so that multiple senior attorneys would need to sign off on completed merger documents, a standard safeguard for transactions of this magnitude. But sometime in July, while I was in Germany, working with Blackstone's regulatory team, Marcus convinced Jennifer Sullivan to streamline the approval process. "We've simplified the signature requirements to avoid bottlenecks during final closing," he told me when I returned from Frankfurt. Jennifer agreed that having multiple signature requirements could create unnecessary delays if someone is traveling or unavailable at the critical moment. The new structure gave primary signature authority to the lead deal attorney, which meant Marcus, with secondary authority assigned to whoever was handling the final document preparation. Since I was responsible for preparing the regulatory compliance documentation that formed the core of the merger agreement, the secondary signature authority would presumably fall to me. That makes sense, I agreed, though something about the change felt off. International deals can't afford to be held up by signature logistics. Exactly, Marcus smiled. We need to be able to execute quickly once all the regulatory approvals are in place. Throughout the summer and fall, I continued working around the clock to secure the complex web of regulatory approvals that would make the merger possible. The process was even more challenging than I had anticipated. Every jurisdiction had different requirements, different timelines, and different political sensitivities that needed to be managed carefully. The European Union approval process alone required 3 separate filings with different directorate generals, each with their own concerns about market concentration, data privacy, and technological sovereignty. Asian regulators were primarily focused on ensuring that the merger wouldn't limit competition in their domestic markets, while American authorities were concerned about national security implications of foreign ownership in telecommunications infrastructure. By November, we had successfully navigated all major regulatory hurdles. The EU had granted conditional approval contingent on certain operational commitments. Asian regulators had signed off on the transaction structure, and American authorities had completed their national security review. We were ready to move toward final closing, pending completion of financial due diligence and preparation of definitive merger documents. That's when Marcus made his final move. In early December, I received an email asking me to prepare for a meeting with Jennifer Sullivan about optimizing team assignments for the final phase of the Henderson-Blackstone transaction. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, which seemed odd. Most important business was typically conducted earlier in the week. When I arrived at Jennifer's office, I found Marcus already there, along with 2 other senior partners I didn't recognize. The atmosphere felt formal and uncomfortable, nothing like the collaborative strategy sessions we'd been having throughout the deal process. "Victoria," Jennifer began, "we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about the Henderson-Blackstone transaction." My heart sank. After months of successful regulatory approvals and client satisfaction, what possible concerns could there be? "Marcus has brought to our attention some potential issues with the regulatory compliance strategy," Jennifer continued. "Specifically, there are questions about whether the current structure adequately addresses certain EU competition law requirements." I looked at Marcus in confusion. "What EU requirements?" "We received full conditional approval from the Commission 3 weeks ago." Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Victoria, I know you've been working incredibly hard on this deal, but I'm concerned that your focus on the technical details may have caused you to miss some broader strategic issues. I've been reviewing the EU approval conditions, and I think there are compliance risks that we haven't adequately addressed." The accusation was so unexpected and unfounded that I initially thought there must be some misunderstanding. The EU approval had been the result of months of careful negotiation and legal analysis. I had worked directly with Brussels-based regulatory counsel, coordinated with EU competition officials, and personally reviewed every condition attached to the approval. There were no unaddressed compliance risks. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said carefully. "Could you be more specific about which compliance requirements you think we've missed?" What followed was the most professionally devastating. 30 minutes of my career. Marcus proceeded to raise a series of technical objections to the regulatory strategy, each one plausible enough to sound legitimate, but fundamentally mischaracterizing either the legal requirements or our compliance approach. He questioned my interpretation of EU data localization requirements, suggested that I had misunderstood certain Asian foreign investment restrictions, and implied that my coordination with various regulatory authorities had been inadequate. The senior partners asked detailed questions that revealed they had been briefed on these concerns in advance. This wasn't an impromptu review meeting. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to undermine my credibility and remove me from the deal. Given these concerns, Jennifer concluded, we think it would be best to have Marcus take primary responsibility for finalizing the merger documents. Victoria, you'll continue to support the regulatory compliance elements, but we need someone with more senior judgment handling the final closing process. I left that meeting in a state of professional shock. After 18 months of 16-hour days after successfully navigating the most complex regulatory approval process in the firm's history, after architecting a transaction structure that would reshape an entire industry, I was demoted to a support role on my own deal. But I still believed that excellence would ultimately triumph. The merger documents would speak for themselves, showing exactly who had done the substantive work and developed the innovative legal strategies that made the deal possible. When the transaction closed successfully, the legal community would recognize my contributions regardless of internal firm politics. What I didn't know was that Marcus had been planning something far more sophisticated than simply taking credit for my work. He was preparing to remove me from the picture entirely, in a way that would not only destroy my career, but also ensure that I could never challenge his version of events. The trap was almost ready to spring. The final weeks of January moved with the relentless momentum of a deal 18 months in the making. Every regulatory approval was locked in place. Every financial detail had been scrutinized by armies of accountants and analysts, and both Henderson Communications and Blackstone International were eager to close before the end of the quarter. The $2.1 billion merger that had consumed my life was finally ready to become reality. Despite being relegated to a support role, I found myself handling virtually all the substantive work required for closing. The merger documents were extraordinarily complex. Over 400 pages of legal text governing everything from technology transfer protocols to employee retention agreements across 8 countries. Every paragraph required precise legal language that would satisfy regulators in multiple jurisdictions while protecting both companies' interests. Marcus had taken control of client communications and strategic oversight, but he still needed my technical expertise to actually produce the documents that would finalize the transaction. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was simultaneously too junior to be trusted with deal leadership and too essential to be removed from the detailed legal work. Victoria, I need you to focus on getting the regulatory compliance sections perfect, Marcus told me during one of our daily coordination meetings. Any mistake there could trigger review processes that would delay closing for months. He was right, of course. The regulatory approval conditions were intricate and unforgiving. European authorities required specific operational commitments that had to be reflected precisely in the merger documents. Asian regulators had imposed market access requirements that needed careful legal implementation. American national security officials had demanded certain technological safeguards that required sophisticated contractual language. I worked 18-hour days throughout January, crafting legal language that would satisfy regulators across 3 continents while ensuring the merged entity could actually function as an integrated business. The technical challenges were immense, but I found the work intellectually satisfying despite the political circumstances. This was the kind of high-stakes legal architecture that few attorneys ever got to attempt. The complexity of the regulatory requirements meant that I was in constant communication with legal counsel in London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Brussels. Time zone differences made the coordination exhausting, I would start my day with calls to Asian regulators, spend the afternoon working with European Council, and finish with evening calls to accommodate London business hours. During one particularly long night in late January, while reviewing draft language with Blackstone's Frankfurt-based regulatory team, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden deep in the German legal team's working files was an email thread that hadn't been intended for my eyes. The emails were between Marcus and Klaus Weber, Blackstone's lead attorney in Germany. They were discussing alternative arrangements for deal signature that would ensure smooth execution regardless of any personnel changes at Meridian Capital. The language was diplomatic, but the implications were clear. Marcus was preparing for my removal from the deal, and he was coordinating with opposing counsel to ensure the transaction could proceed without me. What made the emails particularly disturbing was their timeline. The messages dated back to early December, right around the time of my meeting with Jennifer Sullivan about concerns with the regulatory strategy. Marcus had been planning my removal from the deal for weeks, possibly months, and he had been discussing it with attorneys who were supposed to be representing the other side of the transaction. I printed the emails and sat in my office at 2 a.m., trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just office politics or credit theft. This was a systematic campaign to sabotage my career while ensuring that Marcus could complete the deal without any witnesses to his machinations. The next morning, I decided to confront Marcus directly. I found him in his office reviewing financial projections with Henderson Communications CFO Patricia Morrison, who was visiting Seattle for final due diligence meetings. "Marcus, could I speak with you privately when you're finished?" I asked from his doorway. "Of course," he replied with his usual smooth smile. "Patricia, we can continue this discussion after lunch. I think we've covered all the major financial integration issues." After Morrison left, I closed Marcus's office door and placed the printed emails on his desk. "I need you to explain these. Communications with Klaus Weber." Marcus glanced at the emails without any visible change in expression. If he was surprised or concerned about being caught, he hid it perfectly. "Victoria, I can see why these might look concerning out of context," he said calmly. "But Klaus and I were simply discussing contingency planning. In deals this complex, you have to prepare for multiple scenarios. What scenarios require alternative arrangements that exclude me from the deal?" "Look," Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. "I didn't want to have this conversation, but Jennifer and the other partners have been expressing concerns about your performance on this transaction. There's been talk about reassigning you to other projects before closing." The accusation was so brazenly false that I almost laughed. "My performance?" "Marcus, I've successfully navigated regulatory approvals in 8 jurisdictions. The deal is ready to close because of the compliance framework I developed. And that technical work has been excellent," Marcus acknowledged. "But there are other considerations: client relations, strategic judgment, ability to handle pressure during critical negotiations. Some people aren't cut out for the final stages of major transactions." I realized I was looking at a master manipulator at work. Marcus had spent months creating a narrative about my supposed shortcomings, and now he was using that narrative to justify my exclusion from the deal's completion. Even more skillfully, he was presenting my removal as a mercy, protecting me from responsibilities I allegedly couldn't handle. "I think we should let Jennifer make decisions about my role on this deal," I said, gathering up the emails. "Of course," Marcus agreed. "But Victoria, I hope you'll think carefully about how you want to handle this situation. Making accusations about conversations you weren't meant to see could be seen as paranoid or unprofessional. That's not the reputation you want if you're hoping to stay at Meridian Capital." The threat was delivered with his characteristic charm, but it was unmistakably a threat. Marcus was warning me that challenging him would result in my termination, not just my removal from the Henderson-Blackstone deal. I left his office feeling like I was trapped in a chess game where my opponent had been playing by different rules all along. Every move I made to defend myself could be turned against me. Every piece of evidence I gathered could be dismissed as paranoia or unprofessionalism. Marcus had systematically positioned himself as the reasonable, competent deal leader, while painting me as a technically skilled but ultimately unreliable subordinate. But I still had one advantage. I was the only person at Meridian Capital who truly understood the intricate regulatory compliance requirements that made the merger possible. The deal documents I was preparing contained dozens of provisions that required my specific expertise to implement correctly. Without my knowledge of the regulatory framework, even Marcus couldn't successfully close the transaction, or so I thought. February 1st was supposed to be document review day, the final opportunity for both legal teams to examine the completed merger agreement before signatures were finalized. I arrived at the office early, planning to spend the day walking through every section of the 400-page document with Henderson's legal team and Blackstone's representatives. Instead, I found an email from Jennifer Sullivan asking me to attend an urgent meeting in the main conference room. When I arrived, I discovered a scene that seemed designed for maximum humiliation. The entire M&A department was assembled around the conference table, along with several senior partners I rarely interacted with. "Victoria," Jennifer began, "we need to address some serious concerns that have come to light about your work on the Henderson-Blackstone transaction." My heart started racing, but I tried to maintain professional composure. "What concerns?" Marcus cleared his throat. "Victoria, over the past few weeks, I've been conducting a detailed review of the merger documents you've prepared. I'm afraid I've discovered several significant errors in the regulatory compliance sections." He slid a thick folder across the table toward me. "These are just the issues I've identified so far: misinterpretations of EU competition law requirements, incorrect implementation of Asian foreign investment provisions, and what appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding of how American national security conditions should be reflected in the contract language." I opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the pages of detailed legal criticism that Marcus had apparently prepared. The allegations were sophisticated and specific, exactly the kind of technical objections that would be difficult to refute quickly in a room full of people who weren't regulatory experts. But as I read through Marcus's criticisms, I realized what he had done. Every error he had identified was based on a subtle mischaracterization of either the regulatory requirements or the legal language I had drafted. The objections sounded legitimate to non-experts, but they were fundamentally dishonest, designed to create the appearance of incompetence where none existed. "Marcus, these aren't errors," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "These are differences of interpretation about complex regulatory requirements. In most cases, I worked directly with the relevant authorities to confirm the appropriate legal language." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus replied smoothly. "You've been making independent judgments about regulatory interpretation without adequate oversight or review. Some of these provisions could expose both companies to significant compliance risks." Jennifer Sullivan looked grave. "Victoria, given the magnitude of this transaction and the potential liability exposure, we can't afford to take risks with regulatory compliance. We've decided that Marcus will take full responsibility for finalizing the merger documents." The room felt like it was spinning. After 18 months of work, after successfully navigating the most complex regulatory approval process in the firm's history, I was being removed from my own deal based on fabricated technical objections. "I'd like the opportunity to respond to these criticisms in detail," I said desperately. "Many of these issues can be resolved through simple clarification of the legal language." "I'm sure they can," Jennifer agreed, "but we don't have time for extensive revisions. The clients are expecting to close this week, and we need to move forward with confidence in our documentation." Marcus stood up from the conference table. "Victoria, I want you to know that none of this reflects on your value to the firm. You've made important contributions to this deal, and that will be recognized. But sometimes the most professional thing is to step back and let others handle the final execution." I sat there in stunned silence as the meeting dissolved around me. Partners filed out of the conference room offering sympathetic but meaningless encouragements. These things happen in complex deals. You'll bounce back from this. There will be other opportunities. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the firm that I had been removed from the Henderson-Blackstone merger due to performance issues. The gossip network that defines life in Big Law had already begun shaping the narrative that would follow me for the rest of my career. But Marcus wasn't finished. That evening, I received an email asking me to clean out my files related to the Henderson-Blackstone transaction and transfer all materials to Marcus's assistant. The message was professionally polite, but the subtext was clear. I was being erased from the deal entirely. As I gathered 18 months of work product from my office, I felt a mixture of rage and despair that I had never experienced before. Every regulatory analysis, every strategic memo, every carefully crafted contract provision represented months of my life, thousands of hours of expertise, and innovations that would reshape an entire industry. And all of it was being handed over to the person who had systematically sabotaged my career. The final insult came the next morning. I arrived at my office to find that my access to the Henderson-Blackstone deal files had been revoked overnight. When I called IT to report what I assumed was a system error, I was told that my file access had been updated to reflect current project assignments. I was no longer assigned to the biggest deal of my career. That afternoon, Marcus stopped by my office with what he described as good news. Victoria, I've spoken with Jennifer about finding you a new assignment that better matches your skill set, he said with apparent sincerity. We have a mid-market acquisition in the renewable energy sector that could really benefit from your technical expertise. The proposed assignment was a $150 million transaction involving a solar panel manufacturer. Important work, but a fraction of the complexity and prestige of the Henderson-Blackstone merger. It was exactly the kind of assignment that promising associates got after they had been quietly sidelined from the partnership track. That's very thoughtful, I managed to say. I know this transition has been difficult, Marcus continued, but I think you'll find that working on deals that fit your strengths will be much more satisfying than struggling with transactions that require broader strategic skills. After he left, I sat in my office watching the Seattle skyline and wondering how my career had been so completely destroyed by someone I had trusted. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, had been systematically undermined by a colleague who had never created anything of value but excelled at taking credit for other people's work. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness of a February evening, something inside me hardened into cold determination. Marcus had outmaneuvered me politically, but he had made one crucial mistake. He still needed my technical expertise to actually close the Henderson-Blackstone deal. The merger documents were extraordinarily complex, filled with regulatory provisions that I had spent months crafting and that Marcus didn't truly understand despite his criticisms. He could take credit for my strategic framework, but he couldn't actually implement the technical requirements without my knowledge, and I was about to use that leverage in a way that Marcus would never see coming. The Henderson-Blackstone merger was scheduled to close in exactly 5 days. Marcus thought he had eliminated the only person who could threaten his narrative about the deal's success. He was wrong. The weekend before the scheduled closing, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went home early on Friday and actually slept. Not the restless half-sleep of someone mentally reviewing contract clauses, but the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion and emotional numbness. For the first time since starting at Meridian Capital, I had no work to take home, no urgent deadlines hanging over my head, no complex legal problems demanding my attention. It should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like professional death. Saturday morning, I found myself at Pike Place Market, wandering aimlessly among the flower vendors and fish stalls. trying to remember what normal people did with their free time. The February rain turned, the cobblestones slick and reflective, creating a gray watercolor version of Seattle that matched my mood perfectly. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister in California. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Everything okay?" I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone outside of work in months. My personal life had been so completely sacrificed to the Henderson-Blackstone merger that I barely remembered who I was outside of regulatory compliance frameworks and international M&A strategy. I was drafting a response when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Klaus Weber, Blackstone's lead attorney in Frankfurt. It was unusual for international counsel to call on weekends, especially for a deal that I was no longer officially involved with. "Victoria, I apologize for calling on Saturday," Klaus said in his precise English, "but I have encountered some difficulties with the merger documentation that Marcus provided yesterday." My pulse quickened. "What kind of difficulties?" "Several of the regulatory compliance provisions appear to have been modified from the versions we previously approved," Klaus explained. "Specifically, the European data localization requirements and the technology transfer restrictions. The new language may not satisfy the conditions imposed by Brussels." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Could you send me the specific sections you're concerned about?" "I was hoping you could review them," Klaus said. "Marcus told me you were no longer working on the transaction, but these are technical issues that require someone with detailed knowledge of the original regulatory negotiations." Within minutes, Klaus had emailed me the problematic sections of the merger agreement. As I read through Marcus's revisions to my carefully crafted regulatory language, I felt a mixture of professional horror and grim satisfaction. He had attempted to improve provisions that he didn't fully understand, introducing subtle changes that would indeed violate several European regulatory requirements. The modifications weren't catastrophically wrong. They were the kind of technical errors that a sophisticated attorney might make when working outside their area of expertise. But they were wrong enough to potentially trigger regulatory review processes that could delay the closing for months or even derail the entire transaction. Marcus had created exactly the kind of regulatory compliance problems that he had falsely accused me of making. I spent Saturday afternoon on conference calls with regulatory counsel in 3 different time zones, carefully documenting the specific ways that Marcus's revisions violated various approval conditions. The European issues were the most serious, but there were also problems with the Asian foreign investment language and potential conflicts with American national security requirements. By Sunday evening, I had prepared a detailed analysis showing that the merger documents in their current form could not be legally executed without violating multiple regulatory commitments. The transaction that was supposed to close in 3 days was fundamentally flawed due to Marcus's incompetent revisions. Klaus Weber called me Sunday night, European time. "Victoria, based on your analysis, Blackstone cannot sign these documents in their current form. We would be an immediate violation of our commitments to EU authorities." "What about Henderson?" "Communications," I asked. "Have they identified the same issues?" "I spoke with Patricia Morrison this afternoon," Klaus replied. "Their legal team has also raised concerns about the revised compliance provisions. It appears that Marcus made these changes without consulting anyone who actually understands the regulatory requirements." The irony was almost too perfect. Marcus had removed me from the deal to ensure that I couldn't interfere with his moment of triumph. But his lack of technical expertise had created exactly the kind of crisis that would expose his incompetence to both clients and colleagues. Monday morning, I arrived at the office to find chaos. Word had leaked that there were technical issues with the Henderson-Blackstone merger documents, and both client teams were demanding immediate explanations and solutions. The deal that was supposed to close on Wednesday was suddenly in jeopardy. Was barely at my desk when Marcus appeared in my doorway, looking haggard and desperate in a way I had never seen before. "Victoria, I need your help," he said without his usual smooth confidence. There seem to be some technical issues with the regulatory provisions that I can't quite resolve. The admission must have been physically painful for him. After months of positioning himself as the deal's strategic mastermind while dismissing me as a detail-oriented technician, Marcus was being forced to acknowledge that he needed my expertise to save the transaction. What kind of technical issues? I asked, with deliberately neutral professionalism. Klaus Weber is claiming that some of the compliance language violates European requirements, Marcus said, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. I've reviewed the provisions, and they seem fine to me, but the clients are getting nervous. I could have pointed out that Klaus Weber was one of Europe's leading telecommunications regulatory attorneys and was unlikely to be confused about EU compliance requirements. I could have explained that Marcus's revisions had indeed created multiple regulatory violations. I could have offered to fix the problems and save the deal. Instead, I said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out. You mentioned that the final stages of major transactions require broader strategic skills that I don't possess." Marcus's face went pale. "Victoria, I know we've had some disagreements about the direction of this deal, but we can't let personal issues interfere with client service. Henderson and Blackstone are depending on us to close this transaction. I'm assigned to the renewable energy acquisition, remember?" I said calmly. Jennifer made it clear that my role on Henderson Blackstone was concluded. The desperation in Marcus's eyes was almost satisfying. He was beginning to realize that his systematic campaign to exclude me from the deal had also eliminated his access to the technical expertise necessary to complete it. "Look," Marcus said, dropping his voice, "I may have been overly critical of some of your work. The regulatory provisions you drafted were more sophisticated than I initially realized. If you could help me understand the compliance requirements, I'm sure we could work together to resolve these issues." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from Marcus, but it was far too little and much too late. He wasn't acknowledging that he had sabotaged my career. He was simply admitting that he needed my help to avoid professional embarrassment. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I think it would be inappropriate for me to work on a deal that I've been removed from due to performance concerns. That might send the wrong message to clients about the firm's confidence in my abilities." Marcus stood there for a long moment, clearly recognizing that I was using his own political maneuvering against him. He had spent months undermining my credibility and positioning me as unreliable, and now those same characterizations made it impossible for him to openly seek my assistance. "What would it take?" he finally asked. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Marcus was essentially asking what price I would demand for saving his career and the firm's most important transaction. It was a moment of leverage that I had never expected to possess. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said innocently. "Victoria, please. The deal closes in 2 days. Both clients are threatening to walk if we can't resolve the compliance issues. My career at this firm depends on closing this transaction successfully." There it was, the naked admission of what we both knew. Marcus had built his entire professional reputation on deals that I had actually structured and executed. Without my technical expertise, he was just a charming networking specialist with expensive suits and an impressive pedigree. "Have you considered asking Jennifer to reassign me to the Henderson Blackstone team?" I suggested. "If the regulatory issues are as serious as Klaus Weber claims, you might need someone with specific expertise in international compliance requirements." Marcus looked like he was choking on his own words. "I could speak with Jennifer about temporarily bringing you back onto the deal team. Temporarily, as a consultant, to help resolve the specific technical issues that have come up." I pretended to consider the offer. I suppose I could review the compliance provisions as a consulting project, but given the complexity of the regulatory requirements, I would need full access to all deal documents and complete authority over the compliance sections. "Of course," Marcus agreed quickly. And I would need to communicate directly with regulatory counsel in all jurisdictions to ensure that my revisions satisfy the original approval conditions. Whatever you need. And since this would be additional work outside my current assignment, I assume the firm would appropriately recognize my contribution to saving the transaction. Marcus nodded eagerly, clearly willing to agree to almost anything if it meant avoiding the professional catastrophe of a failed closing. What he didn't realize was that I had no intention of saving his deal. By Tuesday morning, I had regained full access to the Henderson-Blackstone merger documents and was ostensibly working around the clock to resolve the regulatory compliance issues that Marcus had created. I scheduled conference calls with international counsel, reviewed European regulatory requirements, and prepared detailed memoranda analyzing the technical problems with the current documentation. To any outside observer, I was doing exactly what Marcus had asked, using my expertise to fix the compliance issues and enable the deal to close on schedule. Jennifer Sullivan even commended my professionalism in stepping up to help resolve a crisis situation. But what I was actually doing was something far more sophisticated. Instead of simply correcting Marcus's errors, I was documenting them in excruciating detail. Every revision I made was accompanied by a legal memorandum explaining exactly why the original changes had been wrong, which regulatory requirements they had violated, and what risks they had created for both clients. I was building an unassailable record of Marcus's incompetence. More importantly, I was creating documentation that would make it impossible for Marcus to take credit for the deal's ultimate success. Every compliance solution was explicitly attributed to my analysis and recommendations. Every regulatory strategy was clearly identified as my work product. Every technical innovation was documented as correcting problems created by Marcus's strategic revisions. Klaus Weber was particularly helpful in this process. As someone who had worked with me throughout the original regulatory approval process, he was able to provide detailed documentation of how Marcus's changes had departed from previously agreed-upon compliance strategies. "Victoria," Klaus said during one of our Tuesday evening calls, "I must say that Marcus's attempted revisions were quite concerning. It appeared that he did not understand the fundamental European regulatory framework that we spent months developing. Would you be willing to memorialize that assessment in writing?" I asked. "Certainly. Blackstone's board will want a detailed explanation of why the compliance provisions required such extensive revision at the last minute." By Tuesday night, I had not only fixed all the regulatory issues, but had also created a comprehensive record that would permanently establish my role as the architect of the Henderson-Blackstone merger's success, and Marcus's role as someone who had nearly derailed it through technical incompetence. But I still wasn't finished. Wednesday morning, the day of the scheduled closing, I arrived at the office before dawn to make final preparations for the signature ceremony. Both client teams would be gathering in Meridian Capital's main conference room to execute the documents that would create one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world. As I reviewed the final merger agreement one last time, I realized that I was holding something much more powerful than just the legal documents for a $2.1 billion transaction. I was holding the culmination of 18 months of my life, the proof of my expertise, and the key to determining who would be remembered as the architect of this industry-reshaping deal. Marcus had spent months positioning himself to take credit for my work. He had systematically undermined my reputation, excluded me from strategic discussions, and nearly destroyed my career in pursuit of a promotion that would be built on my accomplishments. But he had made one fatal mistake. In his desperation to save the deal, he had given me complete authority over the final documentation. And that authority included determining whose name would appear on the signature lines that would make the Henderson-Blackstone merger legally binding. The original document structure had been designed to give primary signature authority to the lead deal attorney, Marcus, with secondary authority for whoever handled the regulatory compliance documentation. But corporate signature protocols are surprisingly flexible, especially in complex international transactions where multiple attorneys might need to execute documents across different time zones. As I prepared the final signature pages, I realized that I had the power to restructure the execution process in a way that would permanently establish the true architect of the Henderson-Blackstone merger. And that's exactly what I was about to do. The Meridian Capital main conference room had been transformed into something resembling a diplomatic summit. Representatives from Henderson Communications occupied one side of the massive mahogany table, while Blackstone International's team sat across from them. Regulatory counsel joined by video conference from Brussels, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. Investment bankers, accountants, and executives filled every remaining seat. At the head of the table sat the signature copies of the merger agreement, 4 leather-bound volumes containing 400 pages of legal text that would reshape the global telecommunications industry. After 18 months of work, everything came down to this moment. Marcus stood at the front of the room, finally living his fantasy of being the commanding presence at a major deal closing. He wore his most expensive suit and his most confident smile as he addressed the assembled group. "Before we proceed with signatures," he announced, "I want to thank everyone who made this extraordinary transaction possible. The Henderson-Blackstone merger represents the kind of innovative legal strategy and flawless execution that defines Meridian Capital's approach to complex international deals." Robert Henderson nodded approvingly. "Marcus, your team has exceeded every expectation. The regulatory framework you developed solved problems that our previous advisors said were impossible to address." I watched from my seat at the side of the room, officially present as Regulatory Compliance Counsel, but effectively invisible to most of the people in the room. That invisibility was exactly what I was counting on. "The signature process will be straightforward," Marcus continued. "As lead counsel, I'll execute the primary documents, and then we'll proceed with witness signatures and notarization." Jennifer Sullivan smiled proudly from her position near the door. This was her star. Attorney, about to complete the deal that would cement Meridian Capital's reputation as a leader in international M&A work. She had no idea that the signature process was about to unfold very differently than Marcus had planned. At exactly 10 a.m., Marcus picked up his Mont Blanc pen and approached the signature table. The room fell silent as he opened the first volume of merger documents to the signature page. This was the moment that would legally bind Henderson Communications and Blackstone International into a $2.1 billion union. But as Marcus scanned the signature page, his confident expression faltered. Instead of seeing his name typed neatly under the authorization line, he saw something completely different. Victoria Chen, Lead Regulatory Counsel and Transaction Architect. "There seems to be an error in the signature designation," Marcus said carefully, his voice tight with controlled panic. I stood up calmly. "Actually, that's correct. Given the regulatory complexity of this transaction and the extensive revisions required to address compliance issues, Jennifer approved restructuring the signature authority to reflect actual document preparation responsibilities." Jennifer looked confused. "I don't recall approving any changes to signature authority." "You approved my return to the deal team with complete authority over compliance sections," I replied smoothly. "Since the regulatory provisions constitute the majority of the merger documentation, that authority naturally extends to execution responsibilities." Marcus was frantically flipping through the other signature pages, discovering that every single document designated me as the primary signatory. His face had gone white as he realized what was happening. "Victoria, this is obviously a misunderstanding," he said with forced calm. "As lead counsel on this transaction, signature authority should rest with me." "But you're not lead counsel on regulatory compliance," I replied. "And since Klaus Weber's analysis yesterday confirmed that the transaction couldn't proceed without extensive regulatory revisions, I think it's appropriate that the person who actually structured those provisions should take responsibility for their execution." The room was beginning to sense tension. though most of the attendees didn't understand the significance of what was unfolding. To them, this seemed like a minor administrative issue about which attorney would sign the documents. Klaus. Weber's voice came through the video conference connection from Frankfurt. If I may interject, Victoria's regulatory framework is indeed the foundation of this entire transaction. Without her compliance structure, Blackstone could not have obtained the necessary European approvals. Patricia Morrison from Henderson. Communications nodded agreement. Victoria's work on Asian regulatory coordination was also essential. We couldn't have structured the deal without her expertise. I felt a surge of vindication as both clients explicitly acknowledged my contributions. After months of being marginalized and dismissed, the people who actually mattered, the clients who were paying millions in legal fees, were publicly recognizing that I was the architect of the deal's success. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Jennifer, surely you can see that this restructuring creates confusion about the chain of responsibility. As the attorney who managed overall deal strategy? What overall strategy? I interrupted, my professional composure finally giving way to controlled anger. The strategy of nearly derailing the transaction through incompetent revisions to regulatory provisions you didn't understand? I walked to my briefcase and pulled out the thick folder of documentation I had prepared over the past 2 days. Would you like me to walk through the specific regulatory violations that your strategic revisions created? The European data localization requirements you misinterpreted? The Asian foreign investment provisions you modified in ways that would have triggered months of additional review? The room was dead silent. Marcus stood frozen at the signature table, finally understanding that his systematic campaign to undermine me had backfired spectacularly. By positioning himself as the deal's strategic leader, he had also taken responsibility for its near failure. Klaus Weber spent 6 hours on Sunday documenting the compliance issues created by your changes. I continued. Patricia Morrison's legal team identified similar problems with American regulatory provisions. Both clients nearly walked away from this transaction because of errors you introduced while trying to improve my work. Robert Henderson looked genuinely shocked. Are you saying the deal was in jeopardy because of attorney error? The deal was in jeopardy because someone without regulatory expertise attempted to revise complex compliance provisions, I replied. Fortunately, we were able to identify and correct those issues before closing. Jennifer Sullivan looked like she was watching her star attorney's career implode in real time. The partners and clients who had gathered to celebrate Marcus's triumph were instead witnessing the exposure of his fundamental incompetence. But I wasn't finished. Marcus, you spent months telling anyone who would listen that I lacked the strategic vision necessary for major transactions, I said, my voice carrying the weight of 18 months of suppressed frustration. You convinced Jennifer to remove me from deal leadership because of alleged performance issues. You positioned yourself as the sophisticated strategist while dismissing me as a detail-oriented technician. I opened the folder and pulled out copies of the emails I had discovered between Marcus and Klaus Weber. But you also spent months coordinating with opposing counsel to ensure the deal could proceed without me. You were so focused on excluding me from the transaction's success that you failed to ensure you could actually execute it competently. The executives from both companies were staring at Marcus with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. No one wants to discover that their billion-dollar transaction was nearly sabotaged by their own attorney's political maneuvering. The irony, I continued, is that you were right about one thing. This transaction did require someone with strategic vision and technical expertise. It just wasn't you. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was completely exposed, stripped of his carefully constructed reputation, and revealed as the incompetent fraud he had always been. I walked to the signature table and picked up the Mont Blanc pen that Marcus had dropped. Since everyone seems to agree that I architected the regulatory framework that made this deal possible, I think it's appropriate that I sign the documents that implement it. With steady hands, I signed my name to the first signature page. Victoria. Chen, Lead Regulatory Counsel and Transaction Architect. Henderson-Blackstone Merger. The room erupted in applause as the $2.1 billion transaction officially became legally binding. But the applause felt different than it would have if Marcus had signed the documents. Instead of celebrating his triumph, the room was acknowledging my expertise and contribution. Over the next hour, as we completed witness signatures and finalized closing documents, I watched Marcus become increasingly irrelevant to the process. Clients directed their questions to me, regulatory counsel coordinated final details through me, and even Jennifer Sullivan began treating me as the lead attorney on the transaction. Robert Henderson approached me as the closing ceremony concluded. Victoria, I have to say that Henderson Communications has been incredibly impressed with your work on this deal. If you ever decide you'd like to work in-house, we'd love to discuss opportunities. Similar offers came from Patricia Morrison and Klaus Weber. In the span of 2 hours, I had transformed from a sidelined associate to the most sought-after regulatory attorney in the room. But the best moment came when Jennifer Sullivan pulled me aside as the conference room was emptying. Victoria, I owe you an apology, she said quietly. It's clear that I was given incomplete information about your contributions to this deal. I'd like to discuss your career trajectory here at Meridian Capital. I looked across the room at Marcus, who was sitting alone at the conference table, staring at the signature pages that bore my name instead of his. The promotion he had sacrificed everything to achieve was gone. The reputation he had built on stolen credit was destroyed. The partnership track he had pursued through systematic backstabbing had disappeared. I appreciate that, Jennifer, replied. But I think I'll be exploring other opportunities. 2 weeks later, I received an offer to join Klaus Weber's firm in Frankfurt as a partner specializing in international regulatory compliance. The compensation was double what I had been making at Meridian Capital, and the work would involve architecting the same kind of complex cross-border transactions that had made the Henderson-Blackstone merger such a professional triumph. I accepted immediately. Marcus Wellborn was quietly asked to leave Meridian Capital 3 months later, after 2 other major deals fell apart due to his incompetent handling of technical legal issues. His career in big law was effectively over. Word travels fast in the legal community about attorneys who nearly destroy billion-dollar transactions through their own ignorance. As for the Henderson-Blackstone merger, it was featured on the cover of International M&A Quarterly as the year's most innovative cross-border transaction. The article quoted extensively from my regulatory framework and described the deal as a masterclass in sophisticated compliance strategy. My name appeared in the headline, Victoria Chen's Regulatory Innovation Reshapes Telecommunications M&A. Marcus. Wellborn wasn't mentioned at all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's being so successful that your enemies become irrelevant. I didn't just defeat Marcus. I made him disappear entirely from the story of the deal he had tried to steal. And every time someone in the international legal community mentions the Henderson-Blackstone merger, they remember it as the transaction that established Victoria Chen as one of the world's leading regulatory strategists. That's a legacy worth 18 months of 16-hour days. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.